So I was consulting two speeches yesterday. One was a speech by Charles Lycett,
yes.
And another was a speech by you. And both were to commemorate your retirement in 2015. So Charles Lycett, he seems to have been disappointed by the fact that you were moved to America after just 4 years at Gonzaga. So what do you remember of your time in America at Gonzaga University in Washington?
I remember the geographical aspect of it very well, because it was beautifully situated in Spokane, and we got the best of winter, lots of snow, cold, but bright, dazzlingly so. And then in summer, I wasn't there for the whole summer, but there it wasn't excessively hot. It was a dry heat. And I remember those are the main memories I have of it. Also remember very clearly an extraordinarily vivid memory of a day out I had after Christmas. There was quite near Gonzaga College was a public park. And I went to this public park just by chance, and it was absolutely stepping into fairyland. You had beautiful sun, you had the sun reflected off the snow, so it was warm and colourful, and children were there skating on the lake in the middle of the park. It was dreamland, and I still try to recreate that image in my mind.
Oh.
And that's one of my great memories of my time there. Also going out in the morning on supply to a convent and driving along happily. In a way I'd never drive here in such a morning, I'd be terrified. But here with the wheels, whatever they did with the wheels, we went along quite easily. So they were the trivial memories. And then of course the charm of the Americans. The students were absolute gentlemen, it seemed. No doubt they were gurriers and lost in them, but in actual fact they were extraordinarily polite and considerate.
Your description there of that park, it reminds me, I think you wrote somewhere that at the origin of Hopkins' poetry there's something very raw, a love of the simple goodness of nature and a terror of losing everything he sought in life. So you talked about your love of that goodness of nature in the park. Is there something of that in Hopkins that you liked to his love of the goodness of nature?
Well, he really loved nature. He had an ambivalent attitude towards it, but he really loved it. And I thought you were going to say, was he afraid of losing it? I've often felt I'll never capture that image again. But he didn't think like that. He seemed to have no difficulty whatsoever in holding the images. It was underlying the usefulness of the images were the thing that worried Hopkins, I think.
And then the whole thing of nature and God doesn't seem to be, our contemporaries don't seem to, they might admire the beauty of nature, but it doesn't necessarily lead them to anything transcendent.
No, I think that's very obvious in nature lovers today in Ireland. That's an end in itself. Whereas Hopkins, it was always a way to God. And yet at times, he seemed to be a bit ambivalent about that. Did it lead him to God or not? Like, for instance, he had the image of going to dinner in, I think it was St. John, the preparatory school for Stonyhurst, not Stonyhurst, for one of the Jesuit colleges, and he had a marvellous time going, absolutely losing himself in nature. Then, seemingly coming back, he forbade himself to look at nature because he had been sharp at dinner with some companion, it seemed. And he said as a penance, he would forbid himself to look at nature, look at this scene again. So therefore, the question that comes to my mind, did he really perceive nature as leading to God, or didn't they?
Oh, so that he might have had a temptation to divinize nature.
Exactly.
So where in Dublin, or where around here, comes in any way close to that idyllic setting you were describing? Is there anywhere more locally where we can get some of that?
No, but not in the intense way that I had in Spokane. But you do have a general sense of well-being as one looks around Gonzaga. And the thing I remember most clearly in that is when I came back here, I was sent for and told to come back. COVID was on the way, and it's better to be at home rather than away. So I came back straight away, and I found myself in paradise here, particularly compared to the paradise that other people were living in.
Yes.
Here I was in a community with Eucharist every day, pleasant companions, a beautiful campus, and everything for other people were trying to make a living in small apartments. And I felt extremely, almost guiltily privileged by that experience. And that, in a way, was the equivalent to my experience in Spokane, but different. It wasn't the intensity of it. It was just a gradual soaking in that I saw myself as damned fortunate, unlike most of the people that I knew. And at that time, my sister was progressing rather rapidly in dementia, so that posed a great burden on the family who lived with her. I could duck out of all of that, really. But that wasn't that was another side of that experience. But the experience of living in this beautiful campus in most agreeable circumstances with very nice people and with the Eucharist every day, that was really something for me.
Father Kennedy O'Brien used to joke that if you join the Jesuits, you have the biggest lawn in South Dublin. I don't know if you ever heard that line, but he was talking about the cricket pitch.
Oh, yes.
Going back to Hopkins, as well as his love of nature, whether someone is a believer or not a believer, I think everyone can unite in their admiration for the skill with which he shapes these religious feelings into poetry. So that must be something of what drew you to Hopkins too, his talent, his skill to make poetry out of his love of nature and his love of God.
Yes, it wasn't so much, I think, his love of nature that caught me. It was just the play of words that really caught me, and I developed a keen interest in Hopkins himself. And then being a Jesuit, I was then into Hopkins the Jesuit as well. But the point that you made should have made a great impact on me, but it really didn't, I think.
And his life then, of course, his life ended at a fairly young age in Dublin, where he wasn't particularly happy.
No.
What when you think of his life, what is it that inspires you about his life, or moves you, or touches you?
I think what touches me most is his absolute resignation to the Lord's will in his life, which he saw as very harsh in certain ways, but that he never budged from his dedication and to his commitment to the society. He said as much himself, reflecting on it. He said, although he may have found it hard and the spirituality a bit difficult, nevertheless he never budged in his loyalty. He wrote very movingly to Canon Dixon, an Anglican canon, who was a teacher of his when he was in high school, as it were, and Dixon was appalled that he should have any doubt about his poetic vocation. He said, one vocation cannot be the enemy of another, and you've got a vocation that's higher than anything that you could have. And Hopkins more or less said, yes, that's right, but it doesn't mean that it's easy. It doesn't mean that I understand it well. Because his great problem was, once he focused on himself, he went into a type of depression. And so much so that in a retreat, a rather blunt man, a very good man, but rather blunt, told him to give up thinking about sin because he thought about himself, and to think about himself wasn't doing him any good. And so he cut that exercise out of his repertoire, as it were.
When you say thinking about himself, what do you mean? What had he been doing before that, and what changed?
No, it was thinking about himself in the context of sin.
Okay.
That once he got on to sin and the types of sin, he experienced a foulness of himself. And so the man directed him, don't do that, it'll only kill you. So he gave up thinking about sin because it led to him thinking about his own sinfulness, which was not great by any means, a few peccadillos here and there, you might say. And but he did go into, I should have brought down, I'd be fumbling around these pages, but they're pretty horrible what he says about himself. Now, I've had a discussion, we've taken opposite sides in this, with Des Egan.
Oh, yeah.
He's all for Hopkins playing down that, and he probably sees me as playing it up. But I think my view has the support of Hopkins' poems. The desolate sonnets.
And in terms of, we know he burns quite a number of his poems. He doesn't have a huge corpus of poems.
Oh, no, he doesn't.
So the scholars are continuing to study a relatively small area, which means, I suppose, new scholars, it's hard for them to get new angles or they end up maybe bringing him into relationship with other thinkers. But what do you think are the best scholarship on Hopkins, and why? Are they the older scholars, or are there more recent scholars?
Well, one of the things, I remember being welcomed to the Jesuit community in Denver, and the chap who welcomed me was a social scientist, and he said, when are you fellas going to work out what Hopkins up? You're not at it long enough now. But there's a richness in his poetry that seems to me that I've never tired of it, and I can go back at it again and again. And it seems like I get different views of Hopkins. And although it's a very small corpus of work, it's extraordinarily rich. And he dealt with the great themes of religious life meaning life, not religious order life, but the life of religious and the life of religion. He dealt with all sides of that and came back to it again and again. And to a certain extent, that no matter where he was, he tended to take things too seriously. You'd think if you went out and had a good batter, drinking for a night, it would have done him good.
Yeah. One thing that struck me a few years ago, I came across a letter, I think he might have written to his sister, where you could see he had a great ear for the Irish accent. He was actually making fun of the way people in Ireland spoke English. So it showed both that the man had a sense of humour and had a great ear for language, which is then evident in his poetry. Do you want to say anything about that? Oh yes. The interesting thing there, that it's the Irish people themselves who taught him the Irish way of speaking English. Because in the English province then, there were a lot of Irish brothers. The brothers came a lot from working class British families who came with their Irish accents and kept those Irish accents. And there's one passage in his letters, he's describing being with the brothers for a month as his novitiate experiment, and the various things he learned from them and how to pronounce certain things, which of course would have driven his precise novice master crackers. But he had that humour, a great sense of humour, and an ability to enjoy a different way of looking at things as these brothers did. Thank you very much.
Do you mind reading that? Or maybe if you could introduce that poem and your own experience of it or memory of it, and then, if you don't mind reading it.
Let me get my spectacles if I have them. I usually find myself without spectacles when I need them. And these aren't the right spectacles either. But be the war within, the brand we yield unseen, the heroic breast not outward steeled, earth hears no hurtle then from fiercest fray. That really pictured, it's a very good image of Hopkins' view of life generally, and of religious life in particular. That it was a battle, and we either overcame that battle with the help of the Spirit, or you were overcome by it in the battle. And while honour has flashed off exploits, so we say, and those strokes once that gashed flesh or galled shield, should tongue that time now, trumpet now that field. And so on the fighter forges glorious day, on Christ they do, and on the martyr may. But be the war within, the brand we yield unseen, the heroic breast not outward steeled, earth hears no hurtle then from fiercest fray. You know, he held up the great example of heroic people, but he said the real battle is inside us. And that was the thing that stamped his spirituality, and stamped the spirituality, I think, of the society of his day. Because he goes on and says, yet God that hews mountains and continents, earth, all out, who with trickling increment, veins violets and tall trees, makes more and more, could crowd career with conquest while there went those years and years by of world without event, that in Mallorca Alonso watched the door. That the external, this was the other thing of Hopkins, the externals didn't matter that much. Whether you were in a very prominent position, whether you were doing great work, whether you were doing little work, like he was the porter, Alphonsus Rodriguez. Well, no one thought much of him, except those who got to know him very well. He was just the porter. But he said what mattered was the battle that went on in him that made him the man he was. And that, I suppose, is what was put before us as novices and as young Jesuits, that what really mattered was how our internal life went, and how the life went externally. Did we do something heroic? Did we have very important positions? They were not important. I remember our master and officers used to take a place called Fumbo in Zambia. Seemingly it was the dregs of a place. Zambia is by and large a lovely climate, but this was down in the valley, and it was considered really the back of beyond. And he used to say, well, now whether you spend your life in Fumbo or in Tongos, doesn't matter. What matters is what you make of the internal life.
That's reminding me of what you were saying about Peter Sutherland, who had been so successful in the eyes of the world, but you made an emphasis on his internal convictions and faith, I suppose.
Oh, yes.
You were, I don't know, is it right to put it in these terms, but it's almost like you were more impressed by his inner state, or whatever you might call that, more than his actual accomplishments that the world could see.
Oh yes, I think so, because also those accomplishments in the world were worldly and had the marks of the world in it as well. You know, the negative side of it. Oh no, I would hold Peter up for his internal life, interior life, rather than his external life.
Mm. So you said last time that the poetry of Hopkins in some way mirrors the spiritual exercises. I have never done the spiritual exercises, but I remember I picked up a book. It was the spiritual exercises, but I was told, I think I read inside the first page, it said, basically, do not do this on your own. Make sure that you're led by someone who knows what they're doing.
Yes.
What I'm trying to get at is, for a normal person or a lay person or a non-Jesuit, I think most people would have no idea what that experience is like.
No.
Carrying out the exercises. So can you paint a picture of that? I don't know how much people share about their own experience, but can you just try to describe some of that?
When I went to California to this parish, and I had given the exercise to sisters, priests, and then this was a group completely lay people, and that remained my clientele, as it were. And I think I've given the exercise in their entirety to about 100 people. So I have a reasonable experience of the lay person coming to the exercises. These people were good coming to them, but they got a great experience. And the experience came from one point of the exercise alone. And it was, when you're doing the exercise, you're asked to enter into the scene itself. And you become part of it. Like the old chap at Bethsaida, who couldn't manage to get to the waters when they moved, because there was no one there to carry him down, as him he was carrying on that way for 30-odd years. But they wouldn't be that level, but they hadn't got any particular experience of the spiritual life, or of certainly not of the exercises, but they really found themselves entering into them wholeheartedly in that way. The one exercise, one part of each exercise which says, enter into the scene, pick out the people, pick out the place, pick out what it looks like. But remember, it says that you aren't just making up a movie for yourself, you're going to make it your own, and that you've got to ask yourself questions which are difficult. And if you aren't hearing the person asking you difficult questions, you aren't listening. So this had quite a remarkable effect, and I find them find them all very much still with the exercise, and they would do the retreat again. A number have. And I've now moved on to asking them to write on the exercise, be it the Transfiguration, let them write on the Transfiguration as experienced by themselves, the crucifixion as experienced by themselves, and some of the miracles, the man born blind, for instance, the man at Bethsaida. And out of that, they become caught up in the exercises, and they do them as thoroughly and as well as anyone could. So that, I hope that answers.
Somewhat, yeah. How long, those ones that you would lead, how long did they take? Was it a month or a few days?
A month.
A month.
In other words, 30 weeks. And they met me once a week, and they had to have a number of exercises each week. And they all remained pretty faithful to that.
And do you have any memory of your own first experience going through the exercises?
I do, in a way. I was very young, I was 17, 18, and I followed them through, I think, diligently, but rather woodenly. That's the way I would felt myself. Mm. And it wasn't until, and even right through the novitiate, we got another retreat at the end of the novitiate. I remember the socialist saying to us, the assistant novice master, when I wrote to my parents saying that I was going on a retreat, he said, haven't you retreated enough? It was Jerry Clark's uncle. But that was a good line of his.